welcome everyone to The Deep Dive.
An in-depth conversation about everyday topics.
I'm your host, Tilo.
And I am Matthew, a.k.a. Matt, a.k.a. Matty March.
So many aliases.
I give that same intro when I'm teaching classes.
I
don't care what you call me. I'm the guy.
Oh, you know what's so funny? I'll tell everyone, I'm Tamara Lopez, but everyone calls me Tilo, like J-Lo with no money.
Exactly.
That's my intro.
I like that. That's good.
Right?
I have to come up with something like that.
You
it
have
won't be
so
as
many.
nice. That's why it won't be as awesome.
Won't be as awesome as that?
It won't be.
You're poking out of your shirt, though.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. It would
The
be.
guy that's tatted up, bro.
Totally.
So, first topic of the day.
Oh, am I going to read it? Okay.
Yeah.
Ooh, this one is, this one's something.
Contentious.
It is. So, minimum wage, right off the bat, you know it's not going to have any strong opinions, should increase to match inflation. So, minimum wage should increase to match inflation. What do you think? What do you think there, Tilo?
Well, I would have to agree because the job that I currently have, there is some sort of wage increase that matches something, I would like to believe. Whenever we are ever looking at bargaining for that, they look at the cost of living and they try and increase salaries, not just based on that. There's other factors that go into that too, but that definitely is looked upon as we need an increase. And why would that be? Well, there's inflation and cost of living goes up. Having worked, obviously, minimum wage jobs in my life, and they were not going up back in that day, and everything else was going up, it was difficult. And I learned, I think, the value of money a lot quicker because of the fact that I was working minimum wage jobs. But then all of a sudden, like say the cost of a movie ticket. So if you go to the dollar cinemas in Central Parkway Mall, these movies were like $1 or $2. And that would be okay when I worked at Byway May minimum wage.
Sure.
Then they opened up Coliseum across from Square One.
Yep.
And it's the world's first round theater, glitzy glamour. It's now a different price. So my minimum wage byway job might not be able to help me go see the movies. But the cost of the movie ticket went up, but my wage never did. And that'd be an example of why I think, especially with the way that inflation is rising, and what minimum wage is even at right now, and the fact that that was just recently increased a couple years ago, which was bonkers. Because, I mean, minimum wage is really not, who is living on that? So I would have to say, yes, please.
So, the funny thing about minimum wage is, in my experience, it is something that people have among the most visceral reactions to, because they think that it's obviously the case that its trajectory in one direction is always good, right? There's the sensation that we have about paying people more money, especially if we ourselves have earned a minimum wage at some point, which many people have, right? If not everybody, if they ever had a job.
Yeah, we all
you
know
know,
$6 an hour.
Absolutely, right?
How was I living on this?
And so, you know, there's always some sort of, sensitivity to that, right? We always think that, we should always get more money, or look at how much money these businesses have, right? They should be able to pay it. But I think there are a couple things to consider there. So number one, I think you and I are a bad example when it comes to adjustments for inflation.
Okay.
Because we earn a federal salary that is subsidized by tax dollars. And so tax dollars are an endless piggy bank that can easily be justified by a wage increase because they just take more money from the public, right?
Oh.
And so that's something they can do, right?
Okay.
But that's because they can do it through edict. They can do it through policy, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Okay.
Right?
And minimum
Whereas
wages.
Minimum wage is a little bit different, right? But so an adjustment for minimum wage relative to inflation does not come out of a bottomless pot of taxpayer dollars like a federal salary does. It comes out of the pocket of the business owner, right? So that's private money you're talking about now, right? Not public money.
Oh.
So I'm not saying that your argument, I disagree with you. I'm just simply saying that to start off with, there has to be a delineation between those two, right? So it's easy for a federal government to say, well, we can negotiate or bargain with the union and we can increase the wages in tandem with inflation, right? And that's an easy way to get people to, number one, not necessarily bargain for any more things beyond that because they get a price of living, standard living increase, right? Totally, right? And if you can get it, ideally, it makes sense. But that's because the government has infinite money, right? And if they want more money, they'll just tax you more, right? And so they can always get more, right? And so that's something that's tenable by the government, and it's really hard to combat that, right? Now, if you're a private sector, though, right, and you don't have an endless amount of tax dollars to just draw from as a piggy bank, then actually in many ways, it seems to be counterintuitive, at least to me, the experience that I've had, not only with people who have lost their jobs because of minimum wage increases, which is always the dirty secret that never gets spoken about, right? Companies are legally beholden to shareholders. They have to maintain certain margins, and they have to have certain increases in profit year after year, legally, right? They have to. And so as a result, if the minimum wage increases, which many people, myself included, like to see on average, especially instinctually, right?
Of course.
Kind of see it. Then the number of people employed at that location drops. The number of people currently employed at that place does not remain consistent because the margin has to be kept. And as a result, if we need to save this much money or make this much money, or this is the budget we've allocated, they don't just say, okay, well, we're going to eat into the shareholders' revenue, right? Because number one, that's a problem, and they may even be in violation of their contract if they end up doing that. And so a big business like Tim Hortons, let's say, right? You work at Tim Hortons, and not you do, but someone does, right?
I could.
Yeah,
you
could.
Of course
you can. Of course you can. Absolutely, right?
You better believe.
You could do whatever you want, and you know, if that's the case, then sure, you can pay the employees $15 an hour versus the $10.25 or $10.50 it was before, something like that, maybe 11. I don't remember what it was. But then they're going to fire staff, right? And so the employees working there will earn more money, but in order to maintain, because money doesn't come from nowhere, like the government, it has to come from somewhere. I know, it has to come from somewhere, right? And so, you know, it's often overlooked that, okay, you can have the people that get to keep their jobs there earn more money, and everyone else gets fired. Right. And so what you're doing is trading the well-being of someone who could have earned $11 an hour, or two people that could have earned $11 an hour. And one of those people's losing their job because two other ones make 15. Right. And so that's how it works. And then you as a customer, your service suffers and the lines take longer because there's less staff. Right.
Wow.
You don't just invent more money when you're a private sector. Right. And so people like to overlook that sometimes. Right. And I'm not saying that means that answers it. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that, yes, you can pay people more money and adjust it for inflation, but raises the minimum wage, we feel like it's right? Like people should get paid more money. People have lots of money, right?
Right. I'm not saying that we paid lots of money, but I just feel like when it comes to how the cost of everything has gone up, even just groceries and gas. Like I was talking about this at work the other day. When I was in Walmart and I was going to get some butter and I looked and I was like, excuse me, did that say $7.95? When did butter become so expensive?
Because the price of fuel went up.
I'm just eating literally now dry crackers and dry bread because I was like, I'm sorry, is that $8 for a tub? No, thank you. No bueno. So if that is the case, like if someone was to make, say, $8 an hour, 1 hour of work pays for one tub of butter. We're looking at, say, human rights again. I just feel like if someone needs to be able to eat, I don't have to all of a sudden be like, I work a job at minimum wage, but I still have to go to a food bank because I couldn't even afford to buy butter because that's what I make in each hour. And that's how, like, even like when I go shopping, when I talk about like the value of $1 for myself, and because I do have a comfortable salary that is, again, I guess, matched with inflation, I will look at what I'm purchasing and how many hours of work that is. Can I justify this, I don't know, Christian Louboutin shoes? The answer is no, because they're $1,000. And I'm like, how many hours of work is that? For a pair of shoes? No dice. But that's how I look at what am I buying and how many hours of work does that break down to?
Sure.
I shouldn't have to, I don't need to think that way because like the salary's pretty comfortable. Those that, for example, make minimum wage would definitely look at it on almost an hourly basis as if I was to work 10 hours, that's this amount of groceries and maybe some gas. So it's kind of concerning to think some people in smaller business are getting left behind. And I've worked for a company that was a mom and pop owned and what they could only offer us, maybe the incentive was you get a discount on some of the items here, was instead opposed to us paying you more money, you get a discount because obviously there's markup. So you get a discount, it's not really costing them much because that cost anyway. So there was that kind of trade-off, but it would have been nice to have, I'm like, well, what if I don't need the product? I'd rather the money. And then instead you're kind of stuck with, well, we can't afford to pay you more. And then it's like, do I stay or do I go find something else and maybe not be as successful in my looking?
Yeah, no, it's true, right? And I mean, the businesses that are most affected by things like that, and including inflation, are small businesses, right? And so it's one of these things, again, where inflation, and I mean, it's important to think about what inflation is. Individual businesses usually have zero to do with inflation, right? It's a symptom of a larger scale economic issue, right? And honestly, the biggest causes of inflation are government policies, and that's across the board. It's not a political partisan argument I'm making. It's governments in general. Governments' poor spending habits for the last at least probably 4 decades have been responsible for the largest increases in inflation. And so the private sector in general is going to have to in some way take the cost of the inflation worked into the minimum wage, if that's what we're doing, because of a circumstance not caused by them, that had nothing to do with them at all. It actually had to do with probably irresponsible spending by their own government that now is then forcing them to pay the bill for it, right? And in some sense, because you in no way have any control over the market or the standard of living, what a business alone does not do, that an entire economy does, right? It's interesting that we would think that it's reasonable to offload that cost to a small business, for instance, right? I know we like to think about big businesses all the time, and they have like plenty of money and plenty of revenue, but small businesses are the ones that hurt the most by that type of
interest. More stakeholders and shareholders
exactly,
in it, so it's different for them as opposed to like the mom and pop owned business.
Absolutely, right? And so it's one of those things again where it's something that to me, on its face, always seems noble. Right? It always does.
Of course,
right?
Because we want to make sure people are able to afford things and live properly and comfortably. We all want to be able to live comfortably.
Absolutely. But I think that as I've gotten older and the more I've learned about how really complicated systems work, right? And I don't really understand them all that well because they're really complicated, right? Like economic landscapes, is a lot of things that intuitively seem to make sense and appear to be noble often end up hurting the people that you think they will help, right? And so, for instance, if you're worried about people not being able to earn enough money to live, essentially, or be able to afford the bare necessities, you're talking about people that are either on the poverty line or you might call in some way impoverished, right? If that's the case, okay, well, you may have helped out 1 or 2 of them then by doing that, but the one that got fired now has nothing, right?
Right.
And so it's one of those things, again, where, these businesses are able to, regardless of size, they will find a way to stay afloat. And that's going to mean cutting the fat in some way, right? Yeah. And so I don't know if that's the best way to address inflation, right? I would say that maybe if inflation is a problem, right, if we can identify what the cause of it is, then I think that having some other mechanism to manage difficulties associated with paying the bills or with making ends meet is going to be better than necessarily offloading that very complex economic feature to a private business and say, well, as a result, you have to pay your employees more. I'm not saying that I don't want them to earn more. I want them to earn more, right? But I think that it's the idea of raising minimum wage to match inflation is an overly simplistic solution to a far more complicated problem that the business did not create and that this does not solve.
And would be easier for some businesses more so than others, so it really isn't even universal across the board.
It's not, right? And so, yeah, I think that my instincts tell me, yes, I want them to earn more money.
Yes, mine
right?
too. But
Absolutely.
then hearing you speaking, I'm like,
yeah,
ooh,
but
man.
Then, yeah.
Really difficult.
And then you'll know when, policies come out. I remember when the minimum wage was raised in Ontario, how much media attention it got for it being basically, the second coming of Jesus. It's basically like, hey, look, we've brought in this incredibly noble and charitable policy that's going to have more people be able to make their ends meet. And it's like, okay, well, that's fine, but you didn't see the cameras of all the people who got fired.
Yeah, and all the businesses that had to go out of business because they could no longer afford to pay individuals, plus maintain a business, pay rent, and or they had to up their products to some ridiculous amount. Like I know some a spa I go to had to do that. I'm thinking, I'm sorry, how much for a manicure right now?
Yeah.
But they're like, well, because of the minimum wage went up, we have to obviously find money somehow. So we're going to increase the cost of our services in order to be sure we can still pay those estheticians. Yes. What can we do? Well, this is what we do. We have to raise the. I'm like, well, I know how to put nail polish on, so thank you, but no, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things. It's the story in my mind that is told, and I think this is the story that people hear because the story I hear, right, which is, we will raise minimum wage in tandem with increases in inflation. And I go, oh, okay. So the story of that means the people currently employed will remain employed. They will earn more money. And maybe the business that pays them in some way will take a revenue hit. Because obviously the money has to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah, it has to.
That's the story that's told, right? But what actually ends up happening from my experience and from examining the fallout of policies like this or similar to ones that have to do with minimum wage in general is some people that are still employable make more. Many people get fired, and the customers that occupy those businesses pay more for everything, while the business maintains the same amount of money.
Oh.
And that's how it works out usually, because a successful business has to be agile. It has to be able to respond to things and maintain its margins. It's not going to just take it on the chin because a policy says, oh, we're going to make you raise it. You will pay the cost, the employee will pay the cost, and the ones that get to keep their job are going to have to work harder for the money that they've earned more now.
Wow.
And so that's usually how it works out. So I think that it's overly simplistic. I think it needs to be addressed differently.
Okay, and I think on that note, I'm actually going to end the topic there because that's a fantastic closing. Because you summed it up in all those different bullet points, and I was like, I'm not even going to bother adding anymore, having some verbal diarrhea over here. So I think that's perfect. I think this is a great time for a break. Thank you, Matt, for doing the summarization. I appreciate that. And
You're too kind. You're too kind.
Right, because you can tell a story. Remember we will be back with more on the deep dive.